In 1836, the first railway to serve the City of London was built. It was only 5 miles long. It ran from London Bridge to Deptford, primarily to bring stock jobbers and clerks into the city. It was built by the London and Greenwich Railway and avoided the expense of bridging over the river by stopping to the south and having commuters walk over London Bridge. Finances were precarious. The steamer from Greenwich cost 9p, but took over an hour and was unreliable because of the tides and the weather. The horse-drawn stagecoach cost a shilling and also took around an hour, but the railway would take just 20 minutes and was priced at a shilling, reduced to 6p if you travelled in the open coaches. When we were working on the Jubilee Line station at London Bridge in the 1990s, I was fascinated by the industrial archaeology, these magnificent brick vaults and arches, some grand, some quite modest, but all full of a sense of history, built to serve the different companies, the London to Croydon Railway, the London to Brighton Railway and South Eastern Railway, all following within a few years of each other in the 1840s. In fact, we were so enamoured that the Victorian engineers inspired our whole design philosophy. At every turn, we wondered what Brunel, Cubitt, Barlow would do if they had access to the modern materials and techniques. The cutting option, as shown here 2 years later, going into Euston, was problematic, as the railway would have been susceptible to flooding so close to the Thames, so the longest brick viaduct in the world was built. Labour was relatively cheap and hundreds of bricklayers were employed. As part of the Jubilee Line project, we closed and pedestrianised Joyner Street, and if you look up, you can sense the history of the station, the workmen who built it, and the entrepreneurs whose ambition drove it. These arches are nearly 200 years old. I look at them with the same sense of wonder as I do the Natural History Museum or the Royal Albert Hall, an amazing legacy that we have much to learn from. Unlike the railways coming into London from the north and west, which were mainly serving more affluent visitors, those coming into the city were primarily for commuters and offered the opportunity to escape overcrowding in and around the city. The railways cut through London, dividing communities. To the north, the major landowners ensured that the railways didn't carve through their properties. Euston, St Pancras, King's Cross, Marylebone were all forced by major landowners petitioning Parliament to stop north of the new road, now Euston Road. But elsewhere, the railway companies wanted to get as close to their destinations as possible and displaced thousands of people in the poorer areas, often without compensation. As more railways were built, they were encouraged by legislation to provide cheap early morning fares, often against the wishes of the railway companies. It is worth looking at the timeline of this amazing 50-year period. A year after London Bridge, in 1837, Euston was built to serve the line to Birmingham. Unlike the railways serving the city, this was primarily for wealthier visitors to London. The first stop on the route was at Harrow. The first Paddington Station was built in 1838, again serving wealthier long-distance travellers. The first stations serving the city, however, were primarily for workers and goods. Bishopsgate Station, again at the very edge of the city, opened in 1840. The same year, Minories Station brought commuters from Blackwall to the edge of the city, and a year later was replaced by Fenchurch Street, which became the first station within the City of London. In 1848, London Waterloo opened, and in 1852, King's Cross. In 1860, London Victoria, serving Kent and Sussex. In 1865, trains running to London Bridge were brought into the city over a bridge to Cannon Street, the second station in the City of London, and another bridge to Charing Cross. Steam trains didn't like gradients, so tracks had to be as flat as possible. The decision to build London Bridge on a viaduct made it easier to cross the Thames. In the same year, Broad Street Station became the terminus for the North London Railway. By the turn of the century, trains were arriving every minute at Broad Street. In 1868, Ludgate Hill Station opened as the terminus for the London, Chatham and Dover Railway, which was extended to Holborn Viaduct in 1886. In 1875, Liverpool Street replaced Bishopsgate, which became for goods trains only. In 1886, Blackfriars opened to serve the southwest boundary of the city. In that 50-year period between London Bridge in 1836 and Blackfriars in 1886, the population of London grew from 1 million to 5 million. Charles Pearson estimated that in 1854, 15,000 commuters took the steamer, 27,000 took the horse-drawn tram, 44,000 took the horse-drawn bus, and 250,000 walked for around an hour. Last year, Weston Williamson started an annual survey of 10 world cities and found that the daily commute is still between 30 to 60 minutes in each of the cities studied. Better public transport, however, provides opportunity and choice of where to live and work. Projects like Crossrail and HS2 extend that hour's commute much further, allowing choice of where to live and work. There were other issues which affected the city. New railway companies were formed, but regulations which had been introduced after the South Sea bubble had been relaxed. Shares in the new companies rose rapidly in what was called railway mania and then collapsed. Thousands lost their savings, including Charles Babbage, inventor of the first computer and a respected economist. Others included Charles Darwin, Benjamin Disraeli, and the Bronte sisters. Charlotte Bronte, in a letter in 1849, said,
"When I look at my own case and compare it with that of thousands besides, I scarcely see room for a murmur. Very many are by the late strange railway system deprived almost of their daily bread."
But despite the failure of some companies, the railway network expanded rapidly. In the UK, a total of 10,000 kilometres of railways were built as a result of projects authorised in just 2 years between 1844 and 1846. That represents over half of our entire current tracks. 272 Acts of Parliament granting permissions for new lines were passed in a single year. In 1863, the first underground trains came into service between Paddington and Farringdon, the next stage in the transformation of the city, expanding the network rapidly. The underground system linked with the major stations, allowing passengers to get closer to their final destinations and providing greater mobility. To feed and fuel the increase in population, London used to be dependent on the railways to bring just about all food and goods into the metropolis: coal, milk, meat, grain. The railways led to a tremendous increase in horse-drawn traffic for both goods and for people. The expansion of the motorway network from the 1960s, combined with lack of investment in railways, meant goods took to the road. This freed up huge areas of land used for sidings and local distribution to further modernise the city. This is Bishopsgate, the former goods yard, now a major development site on the edge of the city as it continues northwards. One of my favourite projects has been the East London line, which has regenerated the area north of the city alongside the Kingsland Road. This was largely built on the old brick viaducts of the North London line into Broad Street, bringing these into use, these magnificent Victorian structures, for stations such as Hoxton behind the Geoffrey Museum, and also trendy cafes, bars, gyms and restaurants incorporated into the viaduct. In 1986, Broad Street Station closed and became the site for the city's first major transport-related development. with the Stanhope Broadgate development. SOM's Exchange House heroically spans over the tracks, and 20 years later, their Broadgate Tower does the same thing. The story continues. One of the speculative projects we are working on is a proposal to close Fenchurch Street Station and build a new station at Tower Hill to serve the Chinese embassy whilst freeing up valuable development land. The Fenchurch Street Station would be converted to bars and restaurants. Post-COVID, some of us might work from home more often, but the city will continue to be a place to meet and do business, and the railways will continue to play an important part. London has led the world in introducing traffic calming measures and investing in rail and metro projects. The process of exporting this valuable knowledge, which began with the Victorian engineers, continues, and this will form a valuable part of establishing the city as a global hub of knowledge. We are in another great age of rail, maximising existing facilities with adjacent commercial and residential developments, whilst adding new opportunities. Projects like the Elizabeth Line is a real heavy gauge railway with platforms 240 metres long. Crossrail gives the city increased connectivity at Farringdon and Liverpool Street, giving people greater choice of where to live and work, and helping keep London as one of the most exciting, best connected and civilised cities in the world.